In the summer of 1942, Nazi Germany stood at the height of its power. Hitler's armies had conquered most of Europe, and the Führer believed the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. But he was about to make a catastrophic mistake. After failing to capture Moscow in the winter of 1941, Hitler turned his attention south. He needed oil, vast quantities of it, to fuel his war machine. The oil fields of the Caucasus lay just beyond a river called the Volga, and guarding that river was a city that would become the graveyard of Nazi ambitions: Stalingrad. Stalingrad was no ordinary city. Named after Stalin himself, this industrial powerhouse on the western bank of the Volga produced tanks, ammunition, and supplies for the Soviet war effort. To Hitler, it was a symbol that had to be destroyed. To Stalin, it was a city that could not fall. In August 1942, German General Friedrich Paulus led the 6th Army toward Stalingrad. The offensive began with devastating aerial bombardment. The Luftwaffe dropped tons of bombs, reducing much of the city to rubble. Smoke filled the sky as buildings collapsed and fires raged across the urban landscape. Tens of thousands of Soviet civilians died in those first days, crushed under falling buildings or incinerated by firestorms. The Red Army defenders, commanded by General Alexander Rodimtsev and coordinated by Soviet General Georgy Zhukov, prepared for the assault. They knew what was coming. They knew the Germans had superior training and equipment, but they also knew something the Germans didn't. They were fighting for survival on their own soil, and they would not retreat. When the German 6th Army reached Stalingrad's outskirts in late August, they expected a quick victory. The Luftwaffe had already destroyed much of the city. Surely, the Germans thought the Soviets would either surrender or be easily defeated in the ruins. They were wrong. The first German soldiers to enter the city discovered something unexpected. Soviet resistance was fierce and organized. The Soviets had transformed Stalingrad into a fortress. Every building became a defensive position. Every street became a potential ambush. Every room became a battleground. The Soviets used the rubble to their advantage. While German soldiers were trained for open warfare, Soviet troops excelled at close-quarter urban combat. What the Germans saw as a destroyed city, the Soviets saw as ideal defensive terrain. They dug trenches in basements, set up machine gun nests in upper floors, and turned apartment blocks into fortresses. General Paulus threw his forces at the city in waves. The Germans had superior firepower and better equipment, but the Soviets had something more valuable: determination and an intimate knowledge of every street, every alley, every building. The battles raged block by block, street by street, building by building. Days turned into weeks. The Germans expected to capture the city in days, then weeks. But by September, as summer turned to autumn, Stalingrad remained unconquered. German soldiers found themselves in a grinding, brutal war of attrition. The legendary Soviet 39th Army held the line stubbornly, and reinforcements kept arriving across the Volga, ferried over by small boats under constant German fire. The death toll mounted. German soldiers, accustomed to victories across Europe, found themselves bogged down in endless urban combat. Soviet defenders, though taking heavy casualties, refused to break. The city became synonymous with death itself. While the fighting raged in the streets of Stalingrad, something extraordinary was happening behind Soviet lines. General Georgy Zhukov and his staff were planning an operation of breathtaking audacity: Operation Uranus. The Soviets had been secretly building up massive reserves of troops, tanks, and artillery north and south of Stalingrad, while the Germans were focused entirely on capturing the city itself. The Soviets were preparing to encircle and destroy the entire German 6th Army. By November, the German advance had slowed to a crawl. The 6th Army was spread thin, with its flanks held by weaker Romanian and Italian forces. The Germans were exhausted. They had suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties. Supplies were running low, but Hitler refused to allow retreat. He ordered General Paulus to take the city at all costs. Then, on November 19, 1942, the Soviets struck. 3 Soviet army groups, totaling over 1 million men, attacked from north and south. The assault was overwhelming. Romanian forces, poorly equipped and poorly led, collapsed almost immediately. Italian forces fared little better. Within days, the German Sixth Army found itself surrounded, cut off from retreat, with no way to resupply except by air. The German High Command was shocked. How had they not seen this coming? How had the Soviets managed to concentrate such massive forces without detection? The answer lay in Soviet deception and German arrogance. The Germans had simply assumed that the Soviets were too weak and too desperate to launch a major counteroffensive. They were catastrophically wrong. General Paulus and his surrounded forces faced an impossible choice: surrender or attempt to break out. Hitler, however, made the decision for him. The Führer ordered Paulus to hold Stalingrad and promised that the Luftwaffe would supply the trapped army by air. Additionally, a relief force under General Erich von Manstein would break through and rescue the Sixth Army. It was a fantasy. The Luftwaffe could not deliver enough supplies. And von Manstein's relief force, though impressive, lacked the strength to break through Soviet lines. As November turned to December, the German Sixth Army found itself in a living nightmare. Trapped in and around Stalingrad, cut off from supplies, surrounded by vastly superior Soviet forces, the German soldiers faced a grim fate. The temperature plummeted. Winter in southern Russia is brutal, temperatures dropping to 20, 30, sometimes 40 degrees below zero. German soldiers, many wearing summer uniforms designed for a quick victory, began to freeze to death. Frostbite became as deadly as Soviet bullets. Hunger became constant. Rations dwindled to nearly nothing. German soldiers ate their horses, then rats, then anything remotely edible. Some resorted to cannibalism. The Sixth Army, which had entered Stalingrad as a proud, confident force, was slowly being destroyed by cold, hunger, and disease. The Luftwaffe, under Hermann Göring's command, had promised to supply the trapped army. But the promise was impossible to keep. The Soviet Air Force contested every flight. German transport planes were shot down regularly. Of the supplies that were dropped, many fell into Soviet hands or were lost in the snow. At best, the Luftwaffe delivered a fraction of what was needed. Thousands of German soldiers starved. Meanwhile, the Soviets tightened their grip. They launched constant attacks, slowly compressing the German perimeter. Surrender was not an option. Hitler had forbidden it. German soldiers had to fight or die. Discipline began to break down. Some German officers and soldiers, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, began to lose faith in Hitler and the Nazi regime. But there was nowhere to go, no escape. They were trapped, and they knew it. By December, it became clear that von Manstein's relief force would not reach them. The Soviet defenses were too strong. The German counterattack stalled. Paulus and his men were abandoned. Winter deepened. The cold became unbearable. German soldiers huddled in ruins, burning furniture and rubble for warmth, slowly freezing to death. Officers tried to maintain discipline, but morale collapsed. Men who had conquered France and pushed deep into Russia found themselves dying in a frozen city, far from home, for a cause that was all read. Lost by January 1943, the German Sixth Army was finished. Starving, freezing, and surrounded, with no hope of rescue, the soldiers faced the end. German generals began to consider the unthinkable: surrender. On January 31, 1943, General Paulus radioed Hitler, "The Sixth Army has fought to the last man as far as possible." Then he surrendered. Not all German soldiers accepted this. Some fanatical Nazi officers refused to lay down their arms. Small pockets of resistance continued until early February, but it was over. The Great German Offensive had ended in total catastrophe. The numbers were staggering. The German Sixth Army had entered Stalingrad with around 270,000 men. Of those, approximately 91,000 surrendered. The rest were dead, killed in combat, frozen to death, or starved. Additionally, hundreds of thousands of German and Romanian soldiers in the surrounding forces were also killed or captured. The Soviet victory was equally costly. Estimates suggest that between 500,000 and 2 million Soviet soldiers and civilians died at Stalingrad. The city was virtually destroyed. But the Soviets had achieved something extraordinary. They had stopped Hitler's offensive, encircled and destroyed an entire German army, and proved that Nazi Germany could be defeated. General Paulus and the surviving German soldiers were marched into captivity. Most would never see Germany again. Paulus himself would spend the remaining years of the war in Soviet POW camps, eventually becoming a propaganda tool for the Soviets. Many German soldiers died in captivity. Those who survived faced a long, bitter journey home to a Germany that was itself collapsing. The Battle of Stalingrad marked a turning point in World War II. Before Stalingrad, Nazi Germany seemed invincible. After Stalingrad, the myth of German military superiority was shattered. The loss of the Sixth Army was a catastrophe from which Germany never fully recovered. The manpower, the equipment, the morale, all were dealt severe blows. While Germany would continue fighting for another 2 years, it would never regain the initiative. From this point forward, the Soviets began their long, grinding advance westward, ultimately conquering much of Eastern Europe. The battle also transformed the Soviet Union. The victory gave Stalin and his generals confidence and prestige. Soviet military capabilities, which had been questioned after the disasters of 1941 and early 1942, were now proven. Generals like Zhukov emerged as strategic masterminds. The Red Army, though still less well-equipped than its German counterpart, demonstrated that it could outthink and outfight the Wehrmacht. Stalingrad became a symbol. For the Soviets, it represented the triumph of the people's will against Nazi tyranny. For the Germans, it represented the beginning of the end. For the world, it demonstrated the horrors of total war and the possibilities of resistance against seemingly overwhelming odds. The city itself was rebuilt, eventually becoming Volgograd. The ruins were cleared, new buildings rose, but the memory of Stalingrad lived on. A testament to the courage and suffering of millions, a reminder of the price of war, and a turning point in human history. In the end, the Battle of Stalingrad was not just a military engagement. It was the moment when the tide of World War II turned. It was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. And it came at a cost so terrible that even today, more than 80 years later, we struggle to comprehend the scale of the suffering.